So now, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, André König. He's a published author, speaker, and expert on deep tech with 25 years of experience, consulting for Fortune 500 companies in addition to his startup experience. He is the CEO of Interference Advisors, the premier data provider within quantum tech, chairman of One Quantum, the leading quantum tech community organization, and managing partner of Entanglement Capital. I love these names, André. Wow, these are really good names. A quantum tech investment fund and startup accelerator. König studied quantum computing at MIT and holds an MBA in economics from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, as well as a master's in business from ICN School of Management. Welcome, André.
Good morning. That was a fantastic intro. MIT was just certificates. I can't compete with the real scientists here. But while I set up, I don't think we've thanked the organizers and hosts yet. So maybe we can give a round of applause to Julie, Maureen, Bijan, and our IT guys in the back that set me up with my toys here. Let me know when you can see the slides and just put them up, please. So we're going to talk about the ecosystem. Worley, who is still sleeping or probably inventing the future, he shared his opinions yesterday. And I love his opinions, but they're opinions. What I want to bring to you, and for those that are a little hangover, is 58 slides of data on the quantum tech ecosystem. And at the end of the day, data are opinions as well, so take it with a grain of salt. But my hope here is to show that opinions in quantum computing are something that you have to be, careful about, especially when you read the media, the press, when you get calls from investors, from experts, people that claim to know what's happening. Reality is very complex. So let's get started. These are kind of the different areas that we cover, and we color code them. Green, stuff is going well. Yellow, we're not seeing much progress. Red, we're a little worried. And this is both a quantitative and a qualitative assessment, probably my opinion. So kicking off with that, but let's dig into some of it. Startups, let's actually do a poll. How many startups in quantum do you think there are globally? Just shout some numbers out. 300? 500? Okay, so we count 511 startups across all applications of quantum information science. You see a little chart here how that has evolved and how that breaks down between quantum computing hardware, software. We also distinguish quantum algorithms. There are companies like Extalbi out there that do algorithms for pharma and drug research. QKD, communications and sensing. And you see how this evolves over time. All these charts and graphs, if you are curious, come to me later. We can dig into them. Geographical distribution, and this is an interesting chart. Let's pull it up a little bit. When you look at it over time, a few years ago, everything was here in the US and in Canada, right? UK started to catch up 3 years ago, roughly. My home country, Germany, didn't really have anything 3 years ago. There have been big government programs, so they've been catching up a lot. It's always very hard to get data on Russia and China, which is why you see some low numbers. Obviously, there's more than one startup in Russia, but we try to stick with verifiable data. And you see countries like India, Israel, and other places in Africa, our friends Quantum South and Uruguay, popping up over the last couple of years. So this ecosystem is starting to spread globally beyond kind of the core markets, which is a consistent observation. We have lists for those that are interested of all these companies, so come see me. We also track the big OEMs. I'm skipping some of these first slides because you probably know much of this. But to me, it's interesting to kind of understand the motivations and business models of these big vendors. IBM is very different from Honeywell, and I'm not talking about modality, superconducting versus ions, but how they think, how they make money, and what that means for their go-to-market, right? And we can talk about that in a little bit more detail. I'm jumping ahead here. We have an assessment of all the different clouds, and different clouds have different revenue models. which is also important to understand. You know, do you have a partnership agreement? Is it a metered, a paid type of approach, or early access, which is the research aspect of partnered clouds? And a lot of these move around. So all of this data is always most interesting when you observe it over time. And again, come talk to me, but we'll look at some of these charts in more detail in a second. Qubit count, not very interesting, you know all of this. So let's look at some things that maybe you don't see as much in the media. Patents, and here we look at Google patents. We always try to get sources that are free. There are better databases for patents, but Google is a good proxy. What's interesting here is if you compare this year to date versus the previous period, there's a dramatic reduction in number of patents, and this is specifically for keyword quantum computing, and that's why I say data is an opinion as well. It's always, how do you set up the search and the categorization? But when you look for patents that mention the term, the key search, quantum computing, we are down from over 850 to just under 300. All of these, and the list is hard to see, but you see the Chinese characters. All of these come out of China, even for quantum computing, and that when many think that China focuses on quantum communications or encryption. Research publications, we see a similar picture, which is kind of surprising with many of us having had to stay at home and probably more time on our hands than usual, but those numbers, well, they are actually up, right? Over the same period, which is good. So there's more research output. Sorry, I was still stuck on patents. And that is good to see. So there's a lot of basic science and basic research that is still happening, again, here for quantum computing out of the Cornell University research. And those trends are consistent for other key word searches, be it when you break it down by hardware or software, encryption, sensing, communications, and so forth. Let's look at the market a little bit, and now we'll start to dig in. Sorry if I go fast on the first part. We've seen some numbers here, and I hate nothing more than an entrepreneur that comes up on a stage and says, this is $1 trillion opportunity. And you see all these bubble charts. We saw some of them yesterday. We'll probably see some of them today. This is a $200 billion market. We're going to conquer 10% of it. Please invest in me. No, you're not. That's bullshit. Number one of all, the market is not that big. These are our own estimates. We actually took a look at all the market forecasts out there. There's this famous $1 trillion forecast. There's a forecast by McKinsey that's about 3 times the size, and we'll take that serious. Everybody else is within 10–15% of our analysis, a little less, a little more. So the market, and I spoke with Worley yesterday, we'll have to increase it because he's making a lot of money. So we'll add a few dollars here. But the market is relatively small. We expect it to grow, but based on what we know today, it is very small. And let me show you how we get to these numbers. Live demos, always the best. So the way we do this, is we set up a bunch of different variables, and then we have a calculator. So the way we assess all of these markets is by models, and that's again where the opinions come in. Well, I don't want everybody to see all the detail. But so we basically, on the left side, write down all the different products, solutions that you could charge revenue for. We break it down by industries and use cases. And we do our own surveys, and people don't always tell us the truth, obviously, because a lot of it is proprietary and secret. But we actually try to model the revenue and the market out in very great detail, unlike many others that just do broad forecasts or try to extrapolate from the high-performance computing market, for example. And if you disagree with my data, it's very simple. Let's sit down, let's take this spreadsheet, we'll plug your numbers in, and you can see where we come out, right? But we try to provide these frameworks. And an update point is the market is relatively small. Supply chain, we left that blank. This is interesting. My friend Doug Finke and the QEDC just released 5 days ago a report on the workforce and the gap that we all know exists and will exist in the future. The big takeaways here is there's a big increase in need across all types of educational profile, but also skills, from scientists to engineers, but business people, developers, influencers, supporters, the entire ecosystem. And that gap is very difficult to fill. We actually went through an exercise at the beginning of this year where we scraped every single person in the US that we could find that works in quantum. And we collected a whole bunch of attributes for them: their degree, their alma mater, their current employment, the gender, race, tenure, and so forth. And what we see is that it is extremely skewed, obviously towards basic science, and that is a good thing in my opinion at this point. But we also see that there's not much happening in kind of these support functions that are getting increasingly more important. If you look at where people work, be it in hardware, in software, algorithms, other applications, again, we see a huge skew towards one side of this equation. And that story just goes through the entire kind of storyline of this analysis, be it if we look at regions, educational degree. Obviously, we need the PhDs, but hopefully you also need people like me with a certificate and an MBA, and you definitely need developers, you definitely need engineers, you need people to maintain your hardware, you need advocates, sales folks, marketing folks, and so forth, and there are very few in the field to find today. By alma mater, we really see that a dozen or so are dominating the field here, very little diversity in terms of educational institutions. Most people are very new to the industry by gender, and you know that with our One Quantum organization, today we have flowers in front of our logo, much better than the salad. But Denise, I just saw you arriving, a president of Women in Quantum. We try to advocate for that a lot. Not a lot of women in the field, and not a lot of diversity. If you look at race, if you look at other attributes, it's even worse. Here we go: ethnicity, nationality, and this is just the US workforce, so obviously most are American. But again, is this how we want to build the future, right? I'll let you make your own conclusions. Governments, you have, and this is something that you can get in other places, so we won't go into detail. If we were to hover over the map and look at the timeline, you'd notice that starting in the US and Canada 5-6 years ago, the UK started to get into the game, then the Netherlands, China and Russia is never so sure what's happening. India, Israel over the last 12 months with big programs. Germany that made it a national priority to catch up, France getting on that as well. Public funding, we'll skip that. So let's look at the meat of this. And this slide is a few months old, not showing you the latest data here. The point was to kind of understand who invests into quantum. Are we starting to see trends there? And obviously, much of the funding originally came from government programs and research partners. And then it started to shift. We never saw that many angel investors, these private rich individuals that might write a $500,000, $100,000, $200,000 check. We very early on saw seed stage and venture capital funds investing into this, and this trend, if you were to see the more recent data, and we'll look at that in a second, is just continuing. So actually very professional capital overall, which is fairly surprising for the maturity stage that we're at in our industry. All right, let's dig into some of the data. Deal. So this is an analysis of, well, we can look at the filter here. So we have investment data in quantum, all modalities and all applications for, it goes back 15 years. There were investments in 1997 here and so forth. The size here obviously represents the cumulative dollar amount invested. And then you can start to dig down into this. Let me get rid of the filter. So the big orange one, quantum computing. Let's open that up. You see that China dominates here, which is due to two very, very large deals that just outshine the rest of the investment money. If you look at the US market, you see some of the deals and total money here. So we can dig into that if my mouse works. The point here is you get into all this detail. You see the other kind of applications, software, algorithms, then encryption, communication, sensing, and how small they are compared to quantum computing hardware. Again, over time, when you look at this over the last few years, just a couple years ago, there was much more of a balance between quantum computing hardware and quantum computing software. As recently as 3 years ago, areas like quantum sensing, quantum communications got some relatively big checks with $20, $25, $30 million investments in certain companies, which was bigger than most quantum computing startups were making back then. That balance has shifted. All the money is moving to quantum computing over the last couple of years, and really over the last 12 months, it is largely moving to hardware. If you strip out China, and when you look at data, we always try to strip out extremes and tail ends, that image shifts a little bit more back into balance between hardware and software, but things like sensing, communications, QKD, not doing very well relatively to the overall amounts. And if any one of you is interested to dig into this, come find me after or send me an email. What's fun here, let me see if I can show this. So this is the data table behind it. We have 1,264 entries and just dozens and dozens of attributes for everything. Here we just looked at an analysis by region. We could look at an analysis by stage, for example, right? So we would just change the parameter here. That's column I. There we go. And now hopefully it will be organized by stage of investment. Was it a seed stage investment, an A round, the SPACs that Worley made a little bit of fun of yesterday, and so forth. Here again, the trends, we'll talk about that in a second, are very interesting. Let's look at this. Actually, another question for you. Do you think that investments, private capital, is up in 2021 or down? Is more money flowing in, the same, or less than in the previous period? Down. Kevin says down. If we count SPACs up, yes. And that is exactly right, Noel. And this analysis is 2 months old, so it changes a little bit because we saw QC-ware, Atom raising 15 million. So there's been about 80 million investments outside of SPACs in the last few weeks. But if you strip these tail ends out, the SPACs and a couple big deals that happened over the same period last year, we were even. 230 million versus 223 million for the half year. Number one, to me, that's a shockingly low number. Number two, it's not up. Number three, the deal count, if you look at the second row, is down dramatically. And that, again, goes to this trend of fewer seed stage investments. New projects have a tougher time finding their seed stage or bridge or follow-on investment. And the investors are saying, we're going to bet on our existing investments, make sure they survive. Worley mentioned down rounds yesterday, 16 of them, which is about right. And really keep them alive. So much more difficult to get a project started, to get early funding. Overall check size has increased, which also means you see more and more of these larger, more professional VC stage type of investors. So the picture is always more complicated than Forbes, Wired, or the Quantum Daily potentially might make you believe. Funding by companies, we can look at this in more detail, but here too we see that the picture is very skewed, right? It's a handful of companies on the software side, and it's a handful of companies on the hardware side that get the money. After that, not much. So it is a race, and those who are not in the kind of leader group are struggling. When we look at deals, and I've only made a couple of my own angel deals, but we broker a lot of deals. we actually do a fairly comprehensive and structured due diligence. So here's a dashboard, and this data, I'm using Multiverse. Multiverse, if you're watching, this is out to date. We did this a couple of years ago, but to show you the methodology, you know, we bring everything together in one kind of interface here in terms of data about the company. And then we do our own due diligence, where we look at 5 elements: the tech maturity, the business maturity, how attractive it is to an investor, the technical readiness level, and outside-inside impact, which is an assessment of the founding team. The key takeaway here is there are frameworks behind all of this. And Worley was joking about that yesterday as well. If an investor writes you a check after an hour, or I would argue even a day or a week, or maybe a month, they are probably not a serious investor, because you have to benchmark your deals, you have to assess your deals, you have to really understand the context and the positioning. Stocks. Just a couple weeks ago, the first pure play quantum computing company went live on the New York Stock Exchange. They're not the first, they are the first quantum computing hardware pure play. Quantum Computing Inc. is a pure play quantum computing software company. Arkit, they have what they call the computing cloud, quantum cloud, trademarked even. Not really sure what it is. And Archer Materials, which is a materials business with a heavy focus on materials for quantum systems, are the 4 stocks available in the market. I don't think there are any huge takeaways here, other than to say that market caps are very low. You see more and more of them coming online, and there's a lot of volatility. You always see kind of a flat phase, which, you know, in 2 of them front runs the volatility, and in 2 of them is at the back end. But there's always a period of excitement, positive or negative, with a lot of volatility, and the rest of the time it's kind of dead. And that's just a symbol of nobody is monitoring quantum in the broader investment community. Nobody really understands it. And if you look at the liquidity, the number of trades, and so forth, the market just isn't there yet. Use cases. Everybody talks about use cases in quantum, and Worley shared his opinions, and no surprise, my data backs up the use cases. So we have another chart here. Let me pull up the interactive graphic. What we did here, pulling up 5 times. What we did is we, in the inner circle, looked at all the different industries that might be affected by quantum computing specifically. Around that, we, in the outer ring of the sunburst, we put all the different use case categories for that industry that might be impacted. The different sizes are representations of the business impact that these use cases in that specific industry can have. And up here in the subtitle, you kind of see the dollar amounts that we estimate over the next 10 years in terms of business impact. And then we have a filter. You know, what can we do today? Kind of around 100 qubits. What can we do in a couple or few years, depending on how you see it, with 1,000 qubits? And what can you do with PsiQuantum when Jeremy finally releases it, or whoever else comes first? And when you break that down, you start to see that you know, the number of opportunities really goes down very fast. In the NISQ era, and again, this is where data meets opinion, right? We had to define what type of qubits, and this is not scientific, probably more art than science, but we put some parameters around that. What is 1,000 qubits? What is 1,000,000 qubits? And we can have those discussions, but there isn't much left. And by the way, this data is based on everything that we just showed you, but we also did a big meta-analysis of archive papers. JP Morgan 2 weeks ago released a great paper on quantum machine learning and how many qubits and quantum volume would be needed to achieve certain applications. So there's a lot of research out there. BCG, McKinsey, that's where we get a lot of this market sizing from. They have very detailed analysis of, you know, we fix batteries for Volkswagen or traffic routing for Daimler-Benz. What is actually the business impact? So we have very solid numbers here. And the takeaway really is just that there isn't much left in terms of applications. That is a little bit of the bad news, in my opinion. A little bit of the good news, when you kind of pull up the overlay here, there aren't, and these are just US companies, there aren't that many companies that ultimately compete in all of these different applications. So we have the dollar amounts here, and also the companies on the hardware and software side that we know compete in all of these specific use cases. So this picture you might think is good news, bad news. There's a next step in it if you actually take a look at the underlying algorithms. These are kind of the proven known algorithms in quantum computing that we know today. If you look at their speed up potential and their robustness, how robust they are in terms of external noise, how well they stand up to it, you see that the top right quadrant, which is where you want to be, high robustness and polynomial speed up, we don't have anything yet. So if you were to overlay these algorithms, and we can talk about that as well, to these use cases, that sunburst goes farther down and you're left with even fewer use cases that might make you money in the future. So really the chicken and egg problem, we really haven't found this use case and application yet that we need to look at. We have a database of hundreds of use cases. Happy to share that. Some more fun stuff. Let's look at that. Do you think that searches, we're looking at Google Trend, people searching for quantum computing this year versus the same period last year, is the public taking more interest, less interest, or the same interest? No opinions? More? It's up by about 40%, but at a very low level. What is interesting is when you dig into that data, the type of searches, which have moved last year from what is a qubit, how many qubits are out there, towards more, what are use cases for quantum computing, what do governments do, what do the big companies do. So to me, an indication that the public is getting more educated and more mature in terms of their understanding and their searches for quantum computing. We did a sentiment analysis of every tweet on quantum computing. Do you think that people have positive, neutral, or negative sentiment on quantum computing? Positive? It is overwhelmingly positive. And you see this quadrant, which is a little small again. It is positive, but with a skeptical undertone. And we actually use IBM Watson sentiment analysis here, which gives you this wheel of different types of emotions. The folks that have negative sentiment, they strongly correlate to a word cloud that contains stuff like Bitcoin. Mark loves that, he's a big investor. Crypto, blockchain, and so forth. So there's a certain population of the public that is negative about quantum, but it's correlated to crypto. Everybody else in the public is overwhelmingly positive, but a little hesitant, waiting to see. The media and the news. Similar to Google Trends, we looked at the 5 largest publications that tend to talk about quantum computing, and I was surprised by that. It's not really up. Personally, I was under the impression that Forbes, Wired, TechCrunch, they write more and more about quantum computing, but that's not really the case. And there's still a lot of volatility. So quantum computing hasn't really penetrated the mainstream media. We'll wrap up with this because I'm getting the signal. We also track research labs, consultants in this space. I'll end with this slide. You've seen the diversity issues. We have a university ranking here, and that's the challenge to Julie and her team. Founders in quantum computing startups by alma mater. Very Ivy League here. We have only 2 European universities, and we hope to see Maryland in it very soon. So that's our data. If you are interested in learning more about any of it, let me know.
Thank you so much, Andre. Having just gone through data analytics in my master's program, I found that really incredibly interesting. And is there a website that we can see some of that, or perhaps we can share?
Data available on kisdata.com, QISdata.com. I share some of these charts that are 6 to 12 month old and have some of the limited data. If you need anything, give me a call or send me an email.
That'd be great. And I was, kind of surprised by if an investor gives you a check after an hour, don't take it. Take it. Just kidding. So I also wanted to add that the Quantum Startup Foundry is proud to partner with Andre's organization, One Quantum. We are running the startup chapter for One Quantum, and so encourage you all to sign up for that. We send out newsletters, and we'd love to feature your news as a startup and some of your investment in that newsletter.